Brown and Black women are deeply impacted, often without realizing it, by the grind of living in a society that does not recognize, let alone reward, their value. Overwhelmingly disbelieved when they try to shed light on their experiences of gendered racism, the lack of support they receive adds to the initial trauma, leaving them questioning reality as well as themselves. Ruby Hamad, White Tears, Brown Scars.
The police found my mom's car abandoned and empty, except for her glasses and a single wrapped gift.
Every day we're closer to finding Doodad.
Dia! Her name is Dia.
Because you're a weirdo. Ever since your mother disappeared, you haven't even tried to hang out with the normal kids.
Someone is trying to recreate Dr. Purdue's work. Where's my mom? I know my mom loves me too much to have left. I just wanted to say, always be my best friend.
I'm gonna find my mom or die trying.
Love you.
Yo, before you hit that dislike or start typing up all the reasons you hated the show, can you give me a minute to make an appeal? Every video essay I've ever made was done in good faith, and I promise you this one is too. Okay. Velma was released on HBO Max earlier this year. When I saw the first stills of it in the spring of 2022, I was unbelievably excited. An adult take on Scooby-Doo? An Indian protagonist? Mysteries with real consequences? A prequel detailing how Velma, Shaggy, Fred, and Daphne started solving mysteries before they got Scooby and the Mystery Machine? An art style I like? Everything about it sounded exactly up my alley, which made the immediate response of negativity, growing with each reveal of a new character or trailer leading up to the series premiere, all the more puzzling and distressing to me. And the vitriol only strengthened as the season went on. You couldn't go anywhere online without seeing people dump on this series, like even on my personal Facebook. And I was afraid to say what I thought about it because my sentiments were neutral to positive. It was a bit of a sociological phenomenon. People who hadn't even seen the show were ready and willing to hate it. The vitriol spread like wildfire. Why? Before we dive into some of the reasons I suspect could have informed this backlash, we need to go over the actual plot. I don't usually do this in so much detail, but I suspect a fair amount of people watching this video and hating on the series did not watch the show in full, and the plot is actually kind of complicated. So let's, as quickly as possible, go over the objective plot of the first season. This will largely ignore the B-plots and focus on the two main components of the story, which is the mystery and the characters' relationships. Velma Dinkley is a maladjusted teenager. Her mother's disappearance 2 years prior has traumatized her deeply, and she blames herself for it. Her father insists that Dia abandoned them, and his denial of Velma's theory, as well as any attempts to investigate, gives her horrifying PTSD-induced hallucinations. To escape these hallucinations, she typically needs the help of a loved one to calm her down. In the first episode, Velma is accused of murder and given a short 24 hours to prove her innocence. Following a lead, Velma and Shaggy, who goes by his birth name Norville in the show, that's always been his real name by the way, get Fred arrested and Velma's name cleared. Ready to focus back on what happened to her mom, Velma discovers another murder. She also finds out Daphne can give her information on her mother, but it comes at a cost due to being her ex-best friend. With the file in hand, Velma discovers her mother's phone last went off in Fred's house and begins to panic. Daphne calms her down, Norville gets jealous, Velma and Daphne grapple with their burgeoning romantic feelings for each other, but decide to remain just friends. Norville attempts to get information from Fred about Dia's disappearance to no avail. Fred is exonerated and another murder occurs. Amon's girlfriend gives birth and Velma is left to grapple with now having a half-sister and even less attention from her father. Fred develops feelings for Velma. Norville gets a girlfriend, Gigi, and struggles to balance spending time with her and helping Velma investigate her mother's disappearance. Velma's PTSD-induced hallucinations become progressively worse as she digs deeper. She discovers that Norville's grandmother, Edna Purdue, used to own Fred's house. Velma learns that Edna Purdue went insane after working on a research project. Her hallucinations worsen, and she suspects that they are linked to her father gaslighting her about her mother's disappearance. Amon agrees to spend time with her and believe her theories, but instead uses her as an excuse to work and get away from his newborn. Velma learns learns that Dia did research for Edna Purdue, and she, Fred, and Amon find the old lab under the Jones house, Amon finally believing that Dia is missing. Fred is kidnapped at a festival, leading the gang to the Crystal Mountain Woods. Daphne, Velma, Norville, and Gigi all end up stuck in the bottom of a ravine. Daphne and Norville are shown to have feelings for Velma. When they escape, they find the killer's lair, living talking brains of the murder victims, and Fred. The lair begins to collapse, and Dia appears and rescues everyone in her van. Velma is elated to see her mother, but Dia has no idea who kidnapped her. She is diagnosed with amnesia and said to have 3 days to regain her memories. Velma attempts to pretend that nothing has changed since Dia left, hoping it will help. Meanwhile, continuing her investigation, she mistakenly accuses Norville's father, and Norville ends their friendship. Daphne and Fred pretend to date to increase their social status, but Velma thinks it's real and is hurt. Dia learns that Amon moved on to another woman, regains her memories in wake of being free from her loveless marriage, and states that she was the serial killer. Velma rushes to prove her mother's innocence. She realizes that Dia was hypnotized into doing the killings, and she herself was hypnotized to blame herself for her mother leaving. Daphne finds the pocket watch that was used bearing the Jones Company logo. Velma finally realizes that Fred's mother Victoria is the killer, attempting to continue the brain experiments of Edna Purdue in order to eventually swap Fred's brain with a more competent one so he can inherit the family business. Velma rushes to the Purdue lab where she rescues Daphne and Fred from Victoria's impending experiment, and a fight ensues. Norville arrives in the midst of the encounter and accidentally kills Victoria. The four of them are lauded as heroes for solving the case, but their bonds built over the season fracture in the wake of Victoria's death and their strained romances. Closing out the season, the sheriff is murdered by a new culprit. Woo! That's quite the story, right? It was hard to condense, even just going over it all for this video. I was surprised by how many twists and turns the story takes, and although there are some gaps in the writing that I'll touch on later in this video, I think the mystery itself, on paper, is a pretty good one. I love mysteries, and I found it to be pretty unpredictable. So, all that said, it makes it that much more gross to me that this show was so maligned in the zeitgeist, off of a teaser, some character art, and the pilot, and I'm going to take a stab at untangling why that might be. This is how colonialism rigged the game against women of color. For centuries, the West has regurgitated representations of colonized women that came to be accepted as more real than the real. Jezebels, Black Velvet, harem girls, China dolls, Princess Pocahontas. All of these reduced complex human beings to cardboard cutout sexual objects without agency, and whose surrendered sexuality was de facto justification for white supremacy. Colonialism rigged the game against all colonized women by reducing them to caricatures that were at once desirable and disgusting, conveniently allowing white men to both sexually abuse them and render them beneath sexual abuse. Ruby Hamad, White Tears, Brown Scars. Velma, in her original design, a white, thin, smart, quippy girl hidden behind glasses and a baggy sweater, is widely sexualized. This is an undeniable fact. You can't scroll on Twitter in October without seeing a provocative cosplay of her on your feed. You can't even type Velma into Google Images without seeing suggestive imagery. In the series Bible for the original 1969 series, Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?, Fred and Shaggy are 17, Daphne is 16, and Velma is only 15 years old. But despite being a teenager in practically every animated iteration of the series, people expect Velma to be sexually consumable. I theorize that one of the reasons the internet took issue with her characterization in this show, whether conscious of it or not, is because of the loss of this aspect of her character. Velma in this iteration is loud, crass, and doesn't cater to the male gaze. And worst of all, according to the internet, she's brown. This Velma does not conform to the established idea of the character throughout the franchise, who doesn't dare to challenge or break ideals of intelligent white femininity. Indian women in American culture are not often objectified. When they are, it's typically light-skinned Indian women with light-colored eyes. They're as close to white as they could be without actually being white. I've experienced it with my own family. When I was young and they would visit, my aunts and even my own mother would comment on the fairness of my skin, though I strongly prefer the way I look when I've spent ample time in the sun. While popular American conversations around colorism in recent years have focused on colorism amongst Black people, this social construct lives in other cultures as well. Skin bleaching products are commonly sold in India and other Asian countries. Entire populations of women of color are sold the ideal of white femininity. And without guidance away from these warped and racist ideals, they bend the knee. The sexuality of women of color is either amplified or negated depending on its usefulness to whiteness. As a Mangalorean, pansexual, non-binary, closeted teenager growing up in a town that was predominantly white and Catholic, it took me leaving my hometown, going to college, and meeting a lot of new, diverse people to begin to shed the shame of being myself. To love the pigment in my knuckles and knees, and my thick wavy hair, and my brown eyes and dark circles, and the whole being attracted to non-men and also not being a girl thing. I wasn't born to dislike or bury these things about myself. I hated everything about who I was when I was a teenager because my environment told me to. I dated multiple races of people, but white boys rarely mirrored my affections or noticed me at all. I was made to feel less beautiful than my white female classmates, told my nose or my darker leg or arm hair or even just my face was ugly from elementary school onward. Internalized racism in a young person of color is not a flaw of that person. It is a reflection of their environment. It's a lack of support system and community and seeing people like yourself in a positive light. And diverse representation online and in the media did not exist 15 to 20 years ago in my most formative years like it does today. As you might have gleaned from the plot overview, Velma is a bit of a loner. She has no strong parental figure in her life, experiencing neglect from both sides, with her mother's alcoholism and her father's general disinterest in anything but his own needs. She's alienated from her peers, and she basically just has one friend in Norville. Daphne stopped talking to her when she was perceived to be more attractive than Velma. The cops who are supposed to be investigating her mother's disappearance don't even get Dia's name right. Velma has no community at school, in her town, or at home. And that's an important thing for a young person to have to develop healthily.
Stop! You can't die!
Why? I'm weird and no one likes me!
An element of Velma's character that I feel a lot of people misinterpreted is her constant grappling with internalized racism. There are various moments throughout the show where Velma expresses distaste for things about herself that are a result of her ethnicity. Her body hair, she hates Indian desserts, etc. A lot of people think that this automatically makes her bad representation for Indian women, and I agree with the sentiment that Mindy Kaling's adult characters have an overwhelming degree of internalized racism as an undeniable component. But Velma isn't an Indian woman, she's an Indian teenager, and that's a whole different ballgame.
So the main criticism I've seen is that people are mad that Devi is whitewashed or doesn't fully accept her culture, and my response to that would be that when you were 15, if you fully embraced and were proud of your culture, then congratulations, but don't discount the experience of those who didn't have that privilege. For example, I neglected my culture for the first 16 years of my life, and I know so many other people who did too, and the truth is that's okay, and we need to make it known that it's okay. Because as first-generation Americans in a society that consistently ostracizes and exoticizes our existence in our culture, it's totally normal to have those feelings, especially as a 15-year-old in high school.
I'm not even sure I would say that Velma is a good person in season 1 of this show. She takes her friends for granted, and many of the characters in the show find her off-putting because of her social defense mechanisms imposed as a result of her inability to trust others due to experiences of child neglect. But she is also smart enough to unravel the mystery of what happened to her mother, and all 3 of the other main characters show romantic interest in her, and she takes the fall for stealing a police car to keep her friends and classmates from getting arrested. Velma is not depicted as an undesirable loser, as many accuse the show of characterizing her as. She's depicted as a teenager, traumatized by her upbringing, her mother's blatant alcoholism and disappearance, and her father's neglect and failure to stabilize her life in the wake of this trauma, ostracized by her peers for the poor coping mechanisms she's developed as a result of these familial failures, grappling with internalized racism because she's grown up without a community around her and has no parental guidance or assurance to be comfortable in her beautiful brown skin, beginning to understand her newly admitted bisexuality. And yes, sometimes she's just an asshole, but so is literally every teenager on the planet. So are all the other main characters. They're still learning how to be people. Looking past the writing style and humor, which are totally subjective, I find the facts of this depiction to be more nuanced than any other Indian female I can think of in adult animation. Because if you haven't noticed, there aren't a lot of depictions of Indian females in animation. Why, when I Google Indian animated characters, is one of the results a fucking dog? And yes, there are Indian female teenagers in cartoons from the last 10 years or so, but they're all animation intended for children or all ages. I recently did a tier list video with my friend Toonerific Tariq where we discussed over 100 adult animated series over a few hours. Do you know how many Indian protagonists there were in those series? 1, and no Indian women. Velma's sardonicism, desire to be loved and seen, destructive emotionality, guilt and responsibility for your parents, adultification due to child neglect, those are all things that my inner child related to while I was watching this show. Those are all things that made me feel seen. A concept that comes to mind when I look at the backlash to Velma's characterization in this series is the concept of the model minority. One of the earliest uses of this term was by sociologist William Peterson in 1966 in the New York Times, discussing how the strong work ethics and family values of Japanese Americans lifted them above problem minorities, an obviously racist framing, primarily against Black Americans who dared to protest against systematic racism. The idea of the model minority extends to all Asian Americans, including Indian people. Between 1965 and 1990, there was a wave of migration of Indian people to the United States via visa programs that targeted skilled and highly educated individuals. This created a stereotype of Indians being high-functioning, educated, well-behaved, docile. It was a governmental ploy during a time of social unrest in America, race riots across the country, and the assassination of MLK. Asian and Indian peoples were not truly valued by white supremacy, but simply used as a tool to further justify anti-Black racism. And when we enforce this model minority myth and allow it to influence our current perceptions, all people of color suffer. And that's one of the reasons I don't hate Velma's characterization in this show. It entirely rejects the model minority stereotype and reclaims her right to just be a flawed human being. Velma is at times crass, offensive, misanthropic, inconsiderate. Her behavior can be shocking, and I think that can actually be a good thing. It's a first. Shows where white men are terrible are largely considered hilarious. There are so many of them. I also recall people saying that Daphne and Velma were bad queer representation. And to that, all I have to say is animation workers were fighting for Korra and Asami, and gay marriage was legalized less than 10 years ago. I was in college when that happened. There is a war raging on queer rights all over the globe. Shitty teenagers being queer is a blessing as much as any other queer character in my eyes, because good representation is not just having a character of color or a queer character who is perfect. Good representation depicts a marginalized person as an actual person with a full range of emotions and flaws. The notion that marginalized characters have to be perfect, upstanding members of society to be good representation enforces the real-world ideology that marginalized people have to be digestible by white society and white supremacy. It flattens the experience of people of color and LGBTQIA+ individuals and feeds into the idea that we have to be flawless in order to be socially acceptable because our race or sexuality is a flaw. These ideas are false. Representation of marginalized people shouldn't be catered to ideals of cis heteronormative white supremacy. It should not require that the characters be good examples of queer people or people of color, tools to influence bigots' ideas of us and move the needle towards good. It should be catered to the people who it is representing. Hey, you know, Orbeez make eating fun. That's what they say in the ads. I'm not super interested in discussing whether the humor or the writing style are good. Some people enjoyed it, and some very vocal fraction of its viewership did not, and that's fine. You don't have to like Velma. Its humor was abrasive and designed to get a reaction out of people, and it certainly did that. People were pissed about the dog missing, but they literally weren't allowed to put Scooby in the show. But there is no denying that the source of the snowball of hatred towards the show was rooted in the online reaction to the race bending of the characters. The day those designs dropped on Twitter, the internet was on fire. I haven't forgotten how so many people online assumed that Norville would be a drug dealer in the show because of his appearance, by the way. That was fucked! Y'all literally racially profiled a cartoon character. I also haven't forgotten that some of y'all actually thought that Mindy Kaling would let a black woman represent the dog. People were enraged at the idea that these characters could ever possibly be anything other than white or go by a different name. We can get rid of Fred and Velma entirely. We can endure hours of Scrappy-Doo and fucking flim-flam, but race-bending the characters had everyone up in arms. It's transparent, and I'm not alone in thinking this. The racist response was captured in the news last summer, before the series was even released. In the Scooby-Doo franchise, there are 8 tabletop games, 14 television series, 10 crossover episodes, 43 animated films, 5 live-action films, 12 animated specials, 46 animated shorts, 15 comic series, and 14 one-off comics, 7 film strips, 6 stage plays, and a whopping 24 video games, which we're going to talk about later this month. For those who don't like Velma, I offer up these 189 other pieces of media for your consumption. The show's existence, the changes to the characters, the humor you didn't like, does not negate the other 189 instances of the franchise. It simply provides a new take, and the first female Indian protagonist in adult animation. A take, by the way, with some really stunning animation work, great casting and voice acting, and great character designs. Each of the main cast has been reimagined in a way that makes sense to me, turned on their head and satirical. The typically brainy and bubbly Velma is a chaotic bisexual mess. Fred is a weak-willed, hairless, reformed feminist in lieu of his typical traditionally masculine bravado. And Glenn Howerton's performance as Fred was one of my favorite parts of the show. Instead of hotboxing the mystery machine, having obscene munchies, and generally being all around useless and afraid, Norville plays a legitimate part in the investigation and is a high-performing student. And Daphne, who rarely does anything other than stand next to Fred and look pretty or roast him, is an independent person discovering the truth about her adoption. But when waiting a week between episodes to see this progression, I can see how a lot of that is lost. I think the series would have benefited from dropping all at once so people could see how it tightened up as it went on, but they obviously were trying to get reactions out of people. And people certainly took the bait. Oh, we can talk about that teaser trailer for a second. It's actually been taken down off of the HBO Max YouTube page now, from what I can tell. I honestly thought it was mildly funny, and that was about it. It addressed the backlash to the race-bent character designs and took the piss out of the whole situation. I thought it would end there. Race-bending white characters never seemed controversial to me in the first place. We do it all the time these days to franchises that have historically been intolerably white, and I welcome the fresh perspective that can bring. But there's an argument to be made about adapting and race-bending white stories when we should be creating our own original stories. My quick answer there is animation companies largely don't want to invest in original stories made by or about people of color. When they do, they get canceled relatively quickly. The landscape is looking pretty bleak right now. Anyway, everyone suddenly decided they hated meta-humor. I blame Rick and Morty for that, and the show was therefore doomed before anyone even saw the pilot. Many people think that the widespread backlash of the show led to Season 2 being greenlit, but Season 2 was already ordered because it's not a real Season 2. The entire show was ordered in one batch and split up into fake seasons in order to avoid giving raises to the staff for the second season. All the backlash really did was invite many people who otherwise would not have cared to contribute to a racist dogpile on a show that did nothing to harm the rest of the franchise. It's all still there! You can watch it if you actually care, but I know a lot of people who made those criticisms are not real Scooby fans. They just enjoy getting angry and making money or clout out of it. There are definitely moments and subplots in the show that I find to be in poor taste. I'm not defending the entire thing. However, I'm also an adult animation fan. One of my favorite episodes of BoJack is the one where he steals muffins from a veteran. I love South Park and Ugly Americans and Clone High. Some of y'all watching this probably love Family Guy or Big Mouth. Watching adult animation typically carries the expectation that boundaries are going to be crossed, because being outrageous and shocking is a way to get people laughing. And Velma was far from the first series to do that. While there are a lot of jokes that don't land for me or feel like their timing is off, especially in the pilot, there are also moments all throughout the show that made me laugh, because I was stunned they had the audacity to do it. I strongly believe that if this had been about a white Velma, people would not have taken so much offense, even going so far as to write articles about specific jokes, to the jokes that were designed to fulfill this style of humor. I think something everyone forgot is that this was never planned to be the next Mystery Inc. It was planned to be an adult animated comedy satirizing a commonly known franchise. I think where it gets lost is in its desire to satirize and create meaningful storylines and relationships at the same time. It's similar to why I think Rick and Morty has never reached its full potential. It's very hard to be funny and dramatic at the same time the way BoJack Horseman, Tuca and Birdie, or King of the Hill have. The comedy tends to hinder the drama in most cases. Velma has a way different vibe in the season finale versus the pilot. There's basically no meta humor and they're just focusing on the story. They almost get to real character growth. and then the comedy aspect blocks it again. So I hope they can iron that out in season 2. Something a lot of people didn't realize is Mindy Kaling didn't write on this show. She was the executive producer and voice actor for Velma. Executive producers typically bankroll a project and may have some involvement creatively, depending. I don't typically love Mindy Kaling's writing. I lost interest in the Mindy project somewhere in season 2. Her sense of humor involves a lot of self-deprecation, and I think that this is indicative of some level of lingering insecurity or immaturity, or a coping mechanism for being brown and not a size 0 most of her life in a society that puts whiteness and thinness on a pedestal. It doesn't matter if you're Eurocentrically beautiful if you're funny and brainy, right? I have yet to watch Never Have I Ever or The Sex Lives of College Girls, but that's an internalization that I have noticed from consuming her work. And while it may not be the healthiest way to go about things, it is a reality for many women of color in white environments, especially as we experience increasing alienation from our parents' generation who did things completely differently than us. However, I think she's held to an unfair standard compared to white female writers her age, as one of the only prominent Indian women in the American entertainment industry. Regardless of whether or not you or I like the results, when there's no seat at the table for Indian women and girls, Mindy makes a whole other fucking table, and I respect that. The last criticism that I want to address is that this show came out as we were getting a lot of news about different cartoons being removed or canceled on HBO Max and other platforms. And while I understand that it is frustrating to see a show that's not as good of quality as the shows getting canceled remain, we have to keep in mind the artists that worked hard on this show, the voice actors, the composers, the cleanup artists, the background artists, the comp artists. There are so many more people than just Mindy Kaling who you were mad at. Also, this frame of thinking ignores the fact that it's the companies that we should be blaming. It's the greedy CEOs who would rather take their $10 million bonus and cut endless amounts of staff and beloved shows from their streaming services. It's not the people who make the shows that survive. It's not their fault that this is happening. It's the fault of those streaming services. This is after I recorded the video and it's off the cuff, but I just felt like it was important to mention. All of these thoughts have been swirling in my head since the show was released, but despite this being a show that I found true representation in, the internet seriously scared me away from sharing my experience with it. Even just my community posts about potentially making this video had some negative comments that freaked me out. Our dialogues are typically remarkably positive, and I really cherish sharing that experience with you. It's a common theme throughout many of my videos that it's easier for people to find obvious weaknesses in a piece of media, take aim and collect the check, than to look for the good in something. It's much harder to take a step back and look at something holistically and objectively, to peel back the layers and try to understand how and why this thing came to be. I grew up broke and brown in a white, affluent Catholic area. I was scared to let my friends see my house, and I wasn't allowed to explain to them why my dad was never around. I had to lie and say he was on business trips. I saw things I shouldn't have seen and knew things I shouldn't have known as a young person. I watched my father choose his own selfish needs instead of his children. I grappled with issues of identity and internalized racism as I grew up alongside predominantly white straight classmates, and my parents were no help there. My Indian mother wrote that we were white on our doctor's intake forms and told me it would get us better care. I was excluded from my white and Indian peers for different reasons because I didn't fit in with either one. I experienced emotional neglect. I deflected with humor and sarcasm. And all of this was on top of just generally being an eccentric person or a freak because I loved cartoons, depending on who you asked. I didn't really get to unwind all of these issues I was grappling with until I created a safe environment for myself in my 20s. And when I watched Velma this past year, I was truly shocked in how I felt seen by a show in ways I never had before. These characters' parents are all failing them in some way. Fred's parents try to make him something he's not. His mom leaves him in a room that she herself set on fire. Norville's parents really do not understand him. Daphne's biological parents try to use her for insurance fraud and steal money from her locker. They're all struggling with expectations put on them, to perform traditional gender roles, to accept their queerness, to make adults believe them. For the first time in my life, I saw myself in a TV show, and I let myself be silenced. But honestly, Velma wasn't bad. It was just mid. The writing was fucking mid. Sometimes the timing or music choices or jokes don't hit, but I had fun watching it. It got better as it went on, and they took the story more seriously and dropped the messy, shitty jokes. I had no desire to rewatch, and if this backlash hadn't happened, I doubt I would have thought of it much after watching until season 2 came out. It's fine if you didn't like it, but I do care that you hear me when I say that this response was overblown, extremely lacking in nuance, and undeniably racist. Sociologist Nancy Wang Yen, in an NBC News article about the series posted last summer, said it best. "It's a fictional character," she said. "Scooby-Doo and the gang, it was a talking dog. For someone to say, that character is meant to be this, I mean, come on." If you made it here without unsubscribing or writing a nasty comment about how much you hated the show and how much you hate me now because I don't hate the show, thanks for watching. I'm sure the response to this one is going to be one of the most polarizing of anything I've ever shared on this channel, and I'm scared, but I've had all of these thoughts marinating in my head for quite some time now, and I felt like it was time to crystallize them and move on. I don't think I'll be making a video about season 2 or discussing the show any further after this. I watch a lot of bread tube videos and cornbread tube videos, and I've always wanted to make one, so I guess this is the first non-bread tube video. Flatbread tube. Who wants to join me? And if you're new here, I don't usually include social justice or leftist topics so blatantly in my content, though it is a through line informing my perspective. If you liked this one, maybe watch my video on the movie Robots. The rest of this year's Scooptober videos will be good old fun nostalgia review and analysis. I just had to get this off my chest first, and this felt like a good time to do it. Stay hydrated, tell your friends you love them, and I'll see you soon.
I am the queen of the universe. The waves part. They engulf me in the waters warm. Can I ask you kind of a weird question?